talking about the history of Native Americans from books, stories, and media. As Americans, we have been socialized to understand Thanksgiving as a peaceful time that Native Americans and settlers came together and compromised. But what we weren't taught along the way, history books didn't seem to show the dark side, the dark past, and the genocide of the indigenous people in North America. Books and stories like Pocahontas misconstrued the history of Native American genocide and oppression in North America. We will also examine how TV and media has socialized us to understand Native Americans and their culture. In this presentation, we will examine how our culture, through the books, stories, and media, have downplayed the Native American experience in our nation's history. Historical events that impact the Native Americans' experience. 10 million Native Americans called America home in the 1600s. By 1865, only 300,000 Native Americans were left. So as you can do the math. A lot of Native Americans deceased. What happened, you might ask? Settlers brought disease and constant welfare to America. The Civil War moved Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. In 1866, Crazy Horse, a religious leader, and Captain William Fetterland, they had the Fetterland's Massacre. 80 U.S. troops died in this massacre. In 1867, U.S. government tries to make peace. This did not work at all. Proposed moving all the remaining Indians into two large reservations to the North and South Plains. In 1876, miners began running over the Sussex Reservation. Americans broke this treaty as well. On June 25th, 1876, Colonial George Custer attacked a group of 2,500 Indians. In 1887, the Dawn Act was passed. Congress finally passed the Citizenship Act in 1924 that allowed Indians to become citizens. Some states did not grant citizenship till after World War II. But you got to ask yourself the question: how do you become a citizen in a country that you're already for?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Native Americans, their history through history books and through the K through 12 education system in the United States. So I believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with the history books and the way the history is taught about Native Americans and about what actually happened. And so history books create a false sense of reality, so kind of a misconstrued notion that paints a better picture of what really happened, you know, from pre-colonial America to now. So I believe there's three major parts that contribute to this, giving this false sense of reality to Americans from when they're young until they're getting older. One is through providing just flat out inaccurate information. Two is by giving biased opinions, so the way they give certain phrases, the way they use certain words in history books, that also contributes to giving this false image of what really happened through Native American history. And then the lack of information, which I believe is just as important as giving false information. Because when you refuse to give certain crucial information, then there's a void, and coupled with biased opinions and inaccurate information, that really helps to give you this false sense of reality. And the important thing to keep in mind is that socialization is something that happens with time. From when the kids are young, hearing these things, hearing the books, what their parents are saying, all together work to paint this, give this, misconstrued notion. So, inaccurate information, one thing that's really important is the way textbooks paint the image is they paint the image of when Columbus came, and during that time, there weren't many Native Americans living in America. And this is something I experienced myself, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this too, because I always thought that, there was a few thousand Native Americans living scattered around, in their own tribes and everything. And here, Charles C. Mann, author of the book, 1491, states, and I'm just going to read it off, myths suggest the hemisphere was sparsely populated by nomadic tribes. The land, for the most part, was a vast wilderness. And then what's important is that he says that's what most of us learned in school. So that's one false information that gives the wrong image. So here I just have, I don't know how well you guys can see this. I got two graphs from the book, and this is showing 1492, the Native American population, and over there is the same dates, and showing the non-native population. And you can see that. And here it says around 5 million, but there's a lot. There's a lot of other historians. Some even suggest that there was more than 15 million Native Americans living. And to us, that might not seem like a big population, but if you consider the population of the world that time, that's a huge population. Yeah, next. So that's kind of that was kind of something that you don't really hear about, that there were millions of Native Americans living with their own, societies, with their own, big tribes and everything. So now we're moving on to biased opinions. So again, I believe they go hand in hand, inaccurate information and biased opinions. So it's the way that you word certain things, it's the way you describe them through history books, and in the education systems, in elementary school, junior high, high school, that gives you this false sense of reality and distort the truth of what really happened in Native American history. So here, before we move on, I'm gonna give you guys a scenario, and this is about the importance of words and stating in history books. Let's imagine that Canadians decide, a group of couple of million Canadians decide to go over into Alaska and take over the land and kick all the people out and put them in, a certain corner and say, like, oh, we're peace-loving and we're taking this land and you guys can, live here in that corner. I'm kicking you all in that corner. What would you call the Canadians? What word would you use? Can just shout some out.
Bullies.
Bullies. Okay. What else?
Conquerors.
Conquerors. Okay. Hypocrites. Okay. But you wouldn't call them settlers, would you? You wouldn't call them pilgrims, would you? You wouldn't call them immigrants, would you? You'd call them, so can we move on to the next? So, settlers, immigrants, so you would call them invaders, aggressors, attackers perhaps? So, and here, I stated that again, I wanted to kind of show it to you before it's up there. So this style of word use conveniently takes blame off of, the European settlers. It takes blame off of the whole institution of what really happened. And it decriminalized the people who did it. So now they're settlers, now they're pilgrims. And to bring up the importance of how this socializes you from when you're young is, I moved here when I was 11 years old to America. I was born here initially, but anyway. So even for me, looking at this is, I still have trouble in my head picturing the European invaders, the European intruders, aggressive. It's always like, oh, well, they were pilgrims. They're the settlers. That's what they're known for. Well, why are they known for that? If these words were used, and these are correct phrases, intruders, invaders, attackers, if these words were used in the textbooks, in the history books, from when you were young, now you would have a different picture. Not totally. This is just one aspect of this, false sense of reality given. But if this was used, you'd get a little bit more clearer picture. Instead of thinking they were just pilgrims, they were, peace-loving intruder. They're peace-loving. You'd think, well, they intruded in this nation. They killed so many, hundreds of thousands of people. They kicked people out of their lands. So this was one good example. Move on. So one big thing is in biased opinions is Christopher Columbus. And so in American textbooks, he's celebrated. Christopher Columbus. He's celebrated as the founder of America, he's always celebrated and portrayed in a good way. So why isn't he viewed as an invader? Why isn't he viewed as, a conqueror who came here and say, basically it's, I came, I saw, I conquered, so can we move on? So James Lowen in Lies My Teacher Told Me says that Columbus claimed everything he saw right off the boat, and we know this is true. When textbooks celebrate this process, they imply that taking the land and dominating the natives were inevitable, if not natural. So we can see how, how this all works to socialize and gives a false sense of reality about the history. Here's another good example about a textbook, a history book actually, called The American Way. And I'm going to read it off too because it's important. The United States Department of Interior had tried to give each tribe both land and money. White European Americans could not understand the Indians. To them, owning land was a dream come true. Like, you're basically saying that the natives were ungrateful, that they were ungrateful. You came in their land, you killed so many of them, and even before that, you wiped 90% of their population got wiped by the plagues you brought over, because, you were unclean and whatnot. Yet now that's what it was though, that's how the plagues came. But now they're saying that, why do Americans could not believe, European Americans could not believe that, to them there was a dream come true. So you're saying, okay, we fought them, now we're offering them these, small patches of land, like I said, in the corner of Alaska or whatever, and they didn't accept it, so they're ungrateful. And because they decided to resist against that, they're ungrateful. So think about yourself, how does this statement influence a false sense of reality? Just wording it a certain way, how important that is to socialize us. One more thing I'm going to quickly mention is the book was from 1979. A lot of you might think that's outdated, but I like to disagree. Because talking about social justice, talking about these events, talking about even slavery and everything that happened in our dark history, 1979 is just yesterday, okay? It's not even a generation. People that have kids now, that aren't even that old, are teaching their kids this now. Or this is, the views that they have, and it does resonate off to your children. There's a lot more recent textbooks that have similar examples, but keeping in mind that something that even happened in the 1950s, that still affects us today, just like slavery still affects African Americans today. So, do they really tell us enough about, do textbooks really tell us enough about the genocide, about what really happened? Do they paint the good picture, or do they socialize us to think in a misconstrued way, in a false sense of reality? Yeah? This has happened, this is how the settlers came over, and the natives wanted to fight against them, blah, blah, blah. And do they really give us the right image? And the one problem is I couldn't even find much on this. This was a problem I had. I couldn't find information, and I couldn't find scholarly articles written on this. Because I think that's one of the problems too, is that, we don't have enough information about this stuff. People don't talk about this enough. So, can we move on? So I believe that the history, so right now we talked about how, the history through information that's false, lack of information, and biased opinion, gives us a false sense of reality about Native American history and what really happened from pre-colonial time to present. But I believe another thing that's equally as important is culture and the stories and the myths, and that's how influence us. And I believe history feeds the culture, and culture feeds history, and it's like an equilibrium situation that they both work together to give us this false sense of reality, in addition to the media, which will come later. So to tell you more about this, the cultures and the stories, Melanie will get to that.
Alright, I'll give you guys some examples of how culture, of this misconstrued history through our culture. Stories, myths, and popular things like holidays. Okay, so famous day, Columbus Day, is a national holiday in the United States, celebrating the arrival of Christopher Columbus in October 12, 1492. It wasn't deemed a national holiday until 1870, but it has long evoked sadness and anger amongst people, Native people and people of color, because they refused to honor this man who opened the doors for Native people's exploitation, slave trade, and colonization of the what they call the European colonization. So now I'm going to show you guys a video. You guys click on the video. I'm going to show you guys a video. It's about some indigenous people urging the celebration of Native American culture and the teaching of America's genocide. Some students from Fort Lewis College in... What's the time? Oh.
some of the headlines.
This is just an example.
You're a member of
Wait.
this day here that we were always taught here in school, to celebrate him and his discoveries. We wanted to celebrate what we still have.
What does it mean to say Christopher Columbus discovered the New World?
Very hurtful for many, many people. That is very hurtful to say, that we were discovered. I am not Native American myself, but have lived in this region in the Four Corners for my whole life, and am half Hispana and half white. And so the stories that I was always told was very clear in school, who discovered who. And it wasn't really until I was a student here at Fort Lewis College also that I saw a different story, and I wanted to be able to share that with others, and that's why we started today.
Noel Alta, you're a senior. You're a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe. Where is your family from in the United States?
So, we're from the Fort Apache Indian Reservation in White River, Arizona, and before there were state lines and borders, my people came from the Whitewater area, so it's part of my clan and it's part of my identity, and that's where they still are today.
You're one of the major organizers of this day of events. What are you trying to convey? For people who are saying, what are you talking about? Christopher Columbus came and he discovered America. Tell a different story to us today.
Well, Amy, I'm just here to share where I come from. And in my tribe, it's really important to use your words wisely and to, there's a saying, "Nijat hayu," and that's where are your ears, my grandma would say, and it's really important to listen more than talk. Creator gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, to listen, because listening is more important than talking sometimes. And I was talking to my grandfather this morning, and I said, "Shawayasteen, I'm talking to Amy Goodman." And he's like, "Who?" I said, "Amy Goodman." "Oh, what tribe is she?" And but you do come from a tribe, and that's really important. You know, your ancestors came, and we all come from a people, and that's part of our identity. And so my job is just to be the vessel that allows others, those peoples that their stories were hidden and erased and silenced on this one day, to share and embrace that.
Esther Belaine, you're with an...
Okay, that's enough. All right. So yeah, so this is an example of how Indigenous people really feel about this topic, and they're advocating for a change towards, regarding the celebration of Columbus Day. So my next example is, Thanksgiving Day. So Thanksgiving Day, as you all know, is just a very, very important holiday. It's part of our culture. It's celebrated the 4th Thursday of November, and it celebrates the arrival of the Pilgrims to the Plymouth Plantation in 1620. So this is a very cool quote that I found in the book Lies My Teacher Told Me. I'm going to read it to you guys. It says, "Considering that virtually none of the standard fare surrounding Thanksgiving contains an ounce of authenticity, historical accuracy, or cultural perception, why is it so apparently ingrained? Is it necessary to the American psyche to perpetually exploit and debase its victims in order to justify its history?" So the history of the foundation of Thanksgiving has a lot of, it's very misconstrued. And some things that we can consider when it comes to these things is that the starting of the American settlement with the story of the Pilgrims doesn't only leave out the Native Americans who are already living here, it leaves out other people who had been here before, like the Spaniards. Actually, like first non-native settlers in the Americas were African slaves who were left here by the Spaniards in 1526 in an attempt to settle. But they had left. The Spanish were here seeking religious liberty, and they introduced things that we know as, a cowboy culture, the horses, cattle, and stuff like that. But however, all throughout history, Spanish are always seen as intruders, whereas British are always seen as the settlers. So this is an example of how, words make a difference when they're trying to depict this history. All these plays into the mythic origin of the country we now know as the United States, which is Plymouth Rock in 1620. So, yeah, so this is a sample historical account that we can find in any kind of history book that you open on this topic. And again, I'm going to read it to you guys. It says, after some exploring, the Pilgrims chose the land around Plymouth Harbor for their settlement. Unfortunately, they had arrived in December and were not prepared for the New England winter. However, they were aided by friendly Indians who gave them food and showed them how to grow corn. When warm weather came, the colonists planted, fished, hunted, and prepared themselves for the next winter. After harvesting their first crop, they and their Indian friends celebrated the first Thanksgiving. And that's from the American tradition. Okay, so, yeah, you can change the slide. All right, so I think we should consider some antecedents that, played into the circumstances that the Pilgrims faced when they first came and settled or colonized. So some important things that happened was that, the Indians had faced a very bad plague or epidemic before the Pilgrims came here in the year 1617. So their population went from I don't exactly know the real number, but it just decreased 90% of how they were before. So the settlers never really faced a challenge when they came and tried to colonize. So the Wampanoags, which is a tribe that met the Pilgrims when they came here, were actually eager to sort of ally with them since the plague had weakened these villages very much. So that's why Masa, it just plays into the legendary warm welcome that they received from the Indians when they first came into Plymouth Rock. So, all right. So another thing is that the rituals we practice today marginalize Native Americans. You can see click on the next. Okay, you can see this is a normal thing that you could find with a Thanksgiving theme, like a postcards. It would say something like, they serve pumpkins, turkeys, corn, and squash. The Indians had never seen such a feast. Go back. All right, so when actually the Pilgrims had never seen such a feast. All the food mentioned there was, it was exclusively indigenous to the Americas and had been provided for or with the aid of the local tribes. So there's this notion of providing for the natives that is not necessarily benign. Because, for example, we are told that white plantation owners provided food, shelter, clothing for their slaves, but in reality, all these things were paid for by black labor. So another thing is that the Pilgrims didn't even introduce to the Thanksgiving tradition because the Eastern Indians had been celebrating or witnessing harvest. Autumnal harvests for centuries before that. And Thanksgiving was only introduced as a national holiday until, only since 1863 when Abraham Lincoln declared it as a national holiday. And the Pilgrims were even introduced in the culture theme of how it is presented until 1890. So we can see how ethnocentric our culture is. And this ethnocentrism doesn't allow students nowadays to really, learn how to deal with people from different cultures and how to learn from them. So, you can click on next. So for example, what do Native people nowadays face is censorship. For example, in 1970, the Massachusetts Department of Commerce was going to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing, and they asked the Wampanoags, the tribe that had greeted them all those years ago, to choose a leader to write a speech for them and to present it. And so they didn't allow the person who wrote the speech from the Wampanoag tribe to read it before they had looked it over. So after they looked it over, they didn't even allow the person to present it. So this is what it said. Today is a time of celebrating for you, but it is not a time of celebrating for me. It is with a heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn, wheat, and beans. Massasoit, the great leader of the Wampanoag, knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers. Little knowing that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoags and other Indians living near the settlers would be killed by their guns or dead from diseases that would cut from them. Although our way of life is almost gone and our language is almost extinct, we the Wampanoags still walk the land of Massachusetts. What has happened cannot be changed, but today we work toward a better America, a more Indian America where people and nature once again are important. So what these people censored was not some fallacies, it was actually historical truth. So that's a pretty good example, I think. Thus, our popular culture, our popular history of like the Pilgrim story is not one of like being in perspective, but of deliberate forgetting when it comes to these things. Okay, so my next example is a Pocahontas story that we all know. Well, I guess most of us know from when we were little kids. So it is a film that recreates the legend of how in 1607 Pocahontas, which was a member of the Powhatan tribe, supposedly saved the life of colonist John Smith. So we're going to watch a little clip now, and I want you guys to see if you guys can like sort of pick out what kind of common theme we can see in this regarding the movie Pocahontas. So yeah, just from the start.
Daybreak, we're prepared! What can you expect from filthy little heathens? Here's what you get when races are diverse. Lesbians are hellish bred. They're only good when dead. They're vermin, as I said, and worse. They're savages, savages. Barely even human. Savages, savages. Drive them from our shore. They're not like you and me, which means they must be evil. We must sound the drums of war. They're savages, savages. Dirty, shrieking devils. Now we sound the drums of war.
This is what we feared. The paleface is a demon. The only thing they feel at all is greed. Beneath that milky hide, there's emptiness inside.
I wonder if they even bleed. They're savages, savages.
Barely even human.
Savages, savages.
Killers at the core. They're different from us, which means they can't be trusted. We must sound the drums of war.
They're savages, savages. First we deal with this one, then we sound the drums of war.
Let's go get Houston!
Savages, savages.
So, yeah, any ideas? I mean, other than you thought there was ideas. Okay, so what I saw in this video is that it's a very common theme about this movie is that it's trying. You can go on to the next one. Is that it's kind of depicting that supposedly both sides had intent of genocides against each other, when in reality it was more like the Europeans who brought in the idea that they could own land and that they could privatize everything, which led to the wars and all the genocide. So that's a very important thing that I think is very misconstrued in this movie. And other facts are the real Pocahontas was a teenage child. I mean, pre-adolescent child when she first met colonist John Smith, and she actually married another Englishman, John Rolfe. She was converted to Christianity, and she spent most of her life in England. After that, and in contrast to Disney's Pocahontas, which is depicted as an Aboriginal Barbie, pretty much, and that John Smith is her love interest, it makes no mention about religious faith, or doesn't depict what actually happens to her when she reaches adulthood. So, what is the apparent intent of the film? It seems as if they just wanted to create a mythical history, mythical history of American past, which was paradise and corrupted by Western colonization. So, yeah. So she's always seen as the hero of Euro-Americans, and, you know, she actually had a lot of brothers and stuff, but none of them actually were, you know, known because they didn't do anything for the English. Whereas she actually saved the life of the Englishman. That's why she's so known. So other examples on the media, how the media affects us things. So Naya.
All right, so like we stated before, we're socialized to understand Native Americans through like textbooks and popular culture and stories and myths and things like that. But I want to start off. What are some stereotypes and misconceptions that we all hear about all the time about Native Americans? Have any examples?
Their drawings, reservations.
Yeah, that.
What else? Feathers or like Indian costumes.
That they have casinos and they have malls.
Yeah. So where do you guys think these stereotypes come from? I mean, I know we all don't sit at home, you know, after school and read textbooks just for the fun of it. We watch TV, we watch movies, things like that. So minority groups have oftentimes been left out when it comes to Hollywood and films, and when they are in these films, they're often ridiculed and portrayed as silly and stupid and things like that. And there's no exception for Native Americans. In today's time, media, films, culture, things like that, those work as history-keeping things. So when we watch movies that are supposed to portray history, we'll take that as factual history instead of actually going to look up our own research. So this video we're going to show is a little documentary that talks about the history that's shown in Hollywood about Native Americans.
Yes, they fought savagely, for they were a primitive people, and self-preservation is a primitive instinct.
They say history is written by the winners, and that's surely the case when it comes to the way Native Americans have been portrayed in the movies. Now, we all know that every movie needs a villain, but during the last 100 years, more than 4,000 movies have cast Indians in that role, depicting them as bloodthirsty savages.
Scenes of peaceful wagon trains being attacked by marauding Indians were common plot devices in westerns.
I grew up at a time when John Ford and John Wayne and Randolph Scott et al. Were massacring Indians with single shots.
Turn around, Dick.
That was in the late 40s, and I was in elementary school in Vallejo, California. Because of those movies, my brother and I were the only Indians in the neighborhood and in town and in school. We had to fight our way out of those theaters.
Well, as children, that's who we saw. So we never saw our own image in its reality. And so we had to create our own image. From the time we were growing up, to be strong and proud of who we were was a joke. You couldn't do it.
Indian. Run their dot-gum, dot-blasted sheep over our land just like they owned it. Why don't they stay on the reservation where they belong?
My son asked me this one time. He goes, "Where are the Indians, Mom? Why don't they have them in this movie?" And I was like, well, maybe that's when they put us on the res.
Motion pictures in the United States have been made for white audiences to make money and to portray history. I don't think it's fair to say just to make money, but it is fair to say that the white audience has predominated.
The white men of the West cannot and will not recognize the testimony of those Indians who slaughtered, massacred, and ambushed our parents.
The tribes of the North meet at River Rock to once and forever wipe out all white.
Well, I think that the bottom line is they weren't looking for an accurate portrayal. They weren't trying to tell a Native American story. They were trying to tell a Euro-American story.
Man doesn't forget easily when his wife and kids were butchered.
Cheyenne, what?
Cheyenne, Apache, Blackfoot Sioux. They're vicious killers, all of them, ain't even human.
Not only was the portrayal of the Native American unrealistically negative, but the portrayal of the white man was often unrealistically positive.
Ultimately, you have some contest between the white guy, who is the exemplar of the rugged frontiersman on the one hand, and Indians on the other, and the white guy beats them every time. He's better at being an Indian than they are. There's nothing a white man's not better at being than an Indian.
Horrifying pages in the bloody annals of Indian warfare. A vivid recreation, the day when a lost patrol found the garrison of Fort Bowie slaughtered to the last man.
Tomahawk Trail is a classic Western formula. It talks about Indian ferocity. It talks about Apache atrocities. It shows essentially the American Army and American settlers outnumbered and threatened by an overwhelming force of Native Americans.
Never have so few so bitterly avenged the victims of Apache savagery.
So obviously, as you can see in these clips, Native Americans are shown as the bad guys. They're disrupting these peaceful wagon trails, these peaceful people who are just trying to, settle and everything like that. So they show Native Americans attacking all the time, which isn't an accurate portrayal of history. Like they said in the film, history is often written by the winners, and who those winners are that's the lens that we're gonna see history from. And when the masses are being showed these images over and over and over, that's what's going to be ingrained in our minds, and those are the images that we get these stereotypes from. And oftentimes when we watch movies and when Native Americans are even shown in a film, it's during like the 1800s. Like there's no such thing as a modern Native American. Like they don't exist anymore. Native Americans are, like I said, no exception to this norm. From the early days of Hollywood and even until now, from the days of the Lone Ranger and even to Twilight, these stereotypes are perpetuated. I'm going to talk about a 4-stage model introduced by Cedric C. Clarke. This was a model for all minorities in media and films. He wrote that minorities are often subjected to predictable stages, and particularly in television. He outlined these 4 stages. The first stage is non-recognition. A given minority group is not acknowledged by a dominant media or to even exist. And so these shows are just a couple of examples, Leave It to Beaver and Happy Days. In these shows, you wouldn't even know that there are minorities in America at this time. And when you do show it, they're like the cleaning lady or, someone that's just in the background. There are no predominant roles. And you might say these are old shows. But what's an example of a show where Native Americans are predominant in modern times? Yeah, no one can really think of one. Next one. So the next stage, like I said earlier, is ridicule. So when we do see Native Americans in prominent roles or in these films and shows, they're often ridiculed as silly, lazy, or just simply laughable. And this is crazy because we've all seen Peter Pan, right? We all love this movie as little kids. Pretty much everyone has seen it or heard the story. And I was kind of amazed to see this, looking at it through the lens of, through a critical lens. There's the scene in the movie talking about what makes the red man red. And it's kind of appalling to see that we were shown this as kids.
Teach 'em, pale-faced brother, all about Red Man.
Good. This should be most enlightening. What makes the red man red? When did he first say up? Why did he ask you how?
Why does he ask you how?
Why does he ask you how? Once the ancient didn't know all the things that he knows now, but the ancient he sure learned a lot, and it's all from asking how. We translate for you. On the beach, what's on the beach, and on the beach, and
Yeah, so we all saw this as little kids, and we wonder, where are these stereotypes coming from? Why do we think of Native Americans as people that just jump around with feathers on their heads? It's because of things like this. We all watched this as a kid with no, we just look at it as innocent little kids, but this is what's ingrained in our minds. So the third stage of Clarke's model is regulation. When there is a predominant role for a minority, in this case Native Americans, they're presented as an enforcer. or an administrator of the dominant group's norms. An example of this was Pocahontas. The only reason why we know her story is because she was a regulator and enforcer of the Euro-American standards. And another example of this is from the 1950s show, The Lone Ranger, where Tonto, which means stupid in Spanish, he is the sidekick to the ranger here, and he just kind of goes along with whatever he says. And they have him, like, he can't speak English, and that's what is always shown all the time. And so, like, when we do see a prominent role that a Native American's in, it's to it's to regulate the dominant group's norms, like we said earlier, like that Euro-American standard, and to follow the law of the Euro-Americans. The last role that, or the last stage that Clark talks about is respect. So this would be the final stage where everything's all good, but unfortunately we don't see too much of this. It's where the minority group in question is portrayed no differently than any other group. Interracial relationships would also not appear extraordinary. We've seen a few of these shows throughout television history, mostly for like Latin Americans and African Americans, where they're more incorporated into television and film, but we don't really see anything for Native Americans. There was a show in the 1990s about Native Americans in Alaska, and it was called The Native Exposure. So this was somewhat of a better show, where it was about a Native American family, and it didn't really focus too much on like the 1800s setting. It looked at modern Native Americans, and it looked at, you know, regular issues that regular people have. They talked about teenage problems and things like that. So it wasn't their Indianness that was like the main focus of the show. So that might be one example. In the late 20th century, sitcoms were huge in TV. And a lot of the sitcoms, they all had to have like a message or a lesson in each show. And there are a few sitcoms that decided to have Native American issues as the lesson for the show. This was a great thing, you know, like, let's be more tolerant of people, more multiculturalism, things like that. But the thing about that was these shows didn't accomplish what they were wanting to accomplish. They perpetuated the stereotypes even more. Because in these shows, the person that they had playing the Native American wasn't even Native American. And when they talked about Native American issues, again, they focused on the 1800s and not modern people that exist now, like Native Americans don't even exist anymore. So what children are shown growing up, those stereotypes that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, we learn them as little kids. When we watch TV like Peter Pan and Pocahontas, what we see is the crazy people with the feathers and things like that, and that's the reason why we have these stereotypes in our minds. And so my question to everyone is, how can we make sure our kids don't grow up believing and implementing these stereotypes into their lives? I think one thing we talked about was educating people about our own cultural backgrounds and just having these simple conversations. And this last video is just a cute little clip about Sesame Street. I think we all know like Sesame Street and PBS have been pretty progressive when it comes to like different backgrounds and cultures and things. So this is just a simple conversation that someone can maybe have with, you know, about not believing everything you see on TV.
Bang, bang, bang. Me give 'em up. No more shoot 'em. Me make 'em heap good deal. Me make 'em. Indians don't talk like that. What do you mean Indians don't talk like that? Indians talk just like that on TV, didn't they, Rick? Right. Well, no matter what you saw on TV with all those Uggs and me want-ems, I'm telling you, Indians don't talk like that. Oh, yeah? Well, how do you know? I'm an Indian. Oh.
Oh, okay. So, in conclusion, we learned about how history books and how like myths and cultural events, you know, such as Thanksgiving and, you know, Columbus Day and all this stuff, and how the media all work together to give us a false sense of reality and create this misconstrued history of what happened to Native Americans and how Native Americans are. And so what can we do to help to fix this, to try to fix history? We can never fix it, but I think what we can do is first educate ourselves. I think education is really big. That's why I think you're all here, to educate yourself about social justice, about issues that our history face, and raising awareness. And I think one of the most important thing for this country as a whole is to accept our dark history. I think that's really the biggest thing that will help us move forward, because if we don't acknowledge that there's blood on our hands, we'll never be able to wash it away of the blood. And I really believe that drives the message home. And I'm just going to read this one last quote that says, there is hope, and it's from the book Genocide of the Mind. And it says, fortunately, over the past decade, there has been a rising interest in the accurate depiction of Native American cultures, Native cultures and histories, as well as present-day struggles. More and more people have become interested and respectful of the truths that somehow evaded history books. So there is hope, and with what Naya was just saying about, Sesame Street, and there is hope. So we can. I think the best way to approach this and try to fix this problem of hiding the history and the facts and everything else, and the depiction of Native Americans, is by accepting our dark history, educating ourselves, and raising awareness. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for the group about the material? Any feedback?
I would say for the slides, you might want to cut down